In this video, we're going to talk about universal design and why it's important for web design. So universal design is a much broader idea about making environments accessible to people of all abilities. When we apply it to web design, we want to think about creating sites that are accessible. Universally designed sites accommodate individual preferences and abilities and communicate necessary information. They're user-centered. So the application of universal design principles minimizes the need for assistive technology and creates sites that are compatible with assistive technology and makes content more usable for everyone, not just people with disabilities. The principles of universal design, and I've adapted these from the Center for Excellence in Universal Design, are many. We're going to start with some of the basic non-technical general principles, and then over time I'll introduce some of the more technical elements that have to do specifically with your coding. So first of all, be consistent in your page design. So something like this. This is representing 3 different pages on the same website, and notice how the headings are in different places. One page has a footer, one has a left nav bar, one has a larger footer at the bottom and a heading that's in a different orientation. So having this kind of inconsistency would make it hard to predict where content is going to be located for someone who is using some sort of assistive technology, but it also could be disorienting to just any user who's using the site. Instead, having a consistent site design among different pages is going to help users find information readily and use your site. Part of this is embedded in the structure of your HTML coding. So for example, using your H1, H2, H3, etc., your heading tags consistently and appropriately throughout your pages. That's one way to do this. And remember, we've talked about HTML is for the structure of your page. So you want to have nice, clean HTML that represents the structure accurately. And then using CSS to format elements throughout the site systematically. That's one of the great things about CSS. Like we've talked about, you can kind of segment all of the design or a lot of the design to your CSS, and you can have one set of CSS code that cascades an aesthetic design throughout an entire page, and as we'll see later, throughout an entire site. You also can enhance clarity with good design, and there's quite a few pieces to this part. First, think about using images, color, and space to enhance content, both for style or aesthetic purposes, as well as accessibility. An example is using informative images and icons to support links. So something like this, right? There's a whole iconography now of readily understood symbols that we can use on our pages to convey information along with words. You don't generally want to use symbols only, but certainly these kinds of icons can be used to help make content clearer. You also can use relevant images to support information in passages of text and to break up segments that are textually dense. So here is a paragraph that's all about Richard III and the Wars of the Roses and the Lancasters versus the York. And I've, accompanied that with a picture of the Tudor Rose, which is combining the symbols of the two families who are battling. So that's just an example of choosing images to be meaningful and also placing them so that they're breaking up blocks of text. You can also use images, color, and space to visually segment information into meaningful chunks. So, something like this where you have sections of content, there's a little bit of space in between, there's even sort of a border to demonstrate, and there's an image that accompanies each to give a quick visual representation of meaning. Good typography is also easier to read, and in general, sans serif fonts are preferred for reading online. So here are some examples of fonts that are harder to read, and just looking at them, I think that's clear. A serif font like Times New Roman. Of the 3, this would be the best, and newspapers and other websites do use Times New Roman, no doubt, but still a serif font is going to be harder to read than a sans serif font, and serif just means it has all the little feet. There are also novelty type fonts like Lucida or compressed fonts, and those can be harder to read for a whole host of reasons. You want to sort of steer clear of those for the body of the text of your page. Instead, choose a font like Arial, Verdana, Tahoma that are sans serif, very clear, very easy to read, and scalable, meaning that users can make them bigger or smaller using functions built into the browser. However, keep in mind you can use stylized fonts like the ones on the left in limited ways, and particularly something like a page title that's meant to be more of a decorative design element. It's fine to use a fancier font there. Now, the other thing you need to keep in mind when choosing your fonts is that not all fonts are going to be supported on all browsers. So something that you have when you're viewing your page on your browser, just on your local system, may work and look great, but when you put it out on the server and someone's looking at that in their own browser that has fewer font choices, your font choice might not show up at all. And so it would be substituted out for the default serif or sans serif font usually, if it renders at all. So there are some things we need to think about in that regard, and we'll talk about that as we get into the intermediate coding about what to do in order to ensure that the fonts that you want to use are going to display on your site. Another thing to keep in mind is that you don't want to use color alone to communicate meaning. Using only color can create problems for people who are colorblind or who are visually impaired. Luckily, there are tools like the Toptal Colorblind Webpage filter that you can use to check your site. And here's an example of a website test. And you can see on the right side, the left side is the regular display, the right side is for a certain type of color blindness. And this site actually allows you to check for 3 different types of color blindness and look at it in grayscale. And grayscale is used in some other assistive technologies for other purposes. Also, you want to have good contrast between the foreground and the background, avoiding complex graphic backgrounds for text blocks that are going to interfere with the writing. Generally, just a solid color background for text blocks that has high contrast between that background and the font color is the best practice. So once again, you can use the Toptal Colorblind webpage filter set to grayscale though, to check the contrast. And now let's go take a look at that tool. And now let's go take a look at that tool for a second so I can just show you some of the settings there. Okay, so we can work with the example page that's here because it's a good example, obviously. So notice there are 4 different settings here. These 3 are different kinds of color blindness. The first 2 have red-green color confusion, and the last one has a blue-green color confusion. So all 3 of these will show how differently. It'll use a filter to show how the contrast changes as you eliminate the color that is problematic for this type of color blindness. So that gives a good view of how that works. To check the contrast, the one you really want to look at is grayscale. So that'll just strip out all the color and give you a sense if you have enough contrast between your background and your foreground. What you would do is just enter the URL of your page that you want to check here, and then click the fetch and filter button, and it will show you results. And it's good to check all the types of color blindness and then use the grayscale to check your contrast. And that gives you just an example of how the grayscale works. This particular page looks like the contrast is just fine. It's still easy to read labels on the buttons compared to the backgrounds. So here we have a little animated GIF. Sorry, you really should avoid flashing, flicker, and unnecessary animation. Remember, while these might be cool once, mainly these effects are annoying, they can be distracting, and worse, they can cause seizures in some viewers. This one's actually relatively subtle compared to some things I've seen in designs. So just keep that in mind, that you want to steer clear of those kinds of effects or use them very, very sparingly. You also want to use multimedia with care in general. Just keep in mind that not all your audience members may be able to access or benefit from the multimedia components you include. It could be because they don't have the required plugin to play the multimedia component, or because they're using an assistive technology that can't render that type of component. What you do want to do is provide an alternative, ideally for audio and video transcripts or closed captioning, so that everyone can benefit from that multimedia content. And then finally, you want to create flexible width design when possible. So that is on your entire page, remember, and this one really is because people are viewing pages on different types of media, whether it's a desktop computer, a tablet device, or a phone. The widths vary widely among those different possible devices that people could be viewing your site with. So in your CSS coding, an easy thing you can do is use percentages with your widths, because percentage will scale with the available size of the screen, right? So that can be a nice and easy way to make sure that you're creating some adaptability in your site. And then a little bit more advanced thing that we'll cover later is to use the @media CSS coding for an adaptive width. And I couldn't help but give you one example. And this is how the code would look. That's just an example of what you can do to do some adaptive coding so that your site will actually change for the environment that it's being viewed on. This is just some beginning information about universal design. It's really important because then everyone can have a good experience with your site. And as we continue on with our coding, I will be talking about elements of universal design and best practices. So be sure to adhere to those.